Grief Stories is not a crisis resource. Please seek support from a qualified professional in your area to meet your unique emotional and medical needs. You're listening to the Grief Stories podcast. I'm your host, Maureen Pollard, a social worker with an interest in helping people find hope and healing when someone they love has died. In each episode, you'll hear a conversation with a guest, sharing their story and insights about what can help when you're adapting to loss. At Grief Stories, we're helping grief make sense, one story at a time. Today's guest is Monique Richard, a fine artist and creator of the digital memoir project With Every Brushstroke, which tells the story of the loss of her twin. Welcome to the Grief Stories podcast, Monique. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Maureen.
At the Grief Stories podcast, we really believe in the power of people's stories to help with healing and grief. And so I want to invite you today to share with me your story. And beginning with your story of loss, tell us a little bit about what happened for you.
Well, it goes back a while. It'll be 15 years now that I lost my identical twin to cancer. My twin Suzanne and I were extremely close. I'm actually going to say still are. But in, I'd say 2000, a little backstory, her and I share a rare blood condition, which I've since learned leaves us predisposed to viral and bacterial, certain cancers. Basically, it's not a good setup. But for whatever reason, Suzanne bore the brunt of anything that could have possibly gone wrong. And it started in 2000-ish and ended in 2009. So over a course of just under a decade, she went through things. I don't know if you remember the show X-Files, but literally there were points in her health journey that things happened that were unbelievable. Like it wasn't just that she died of cancer; it was basically an immune system breakdown. Yeah. And things would happen to her where you think she was going to die, and then she rose like the phoenix. And in fact, what we're about to explain is this digital memoir I created. One of the chapters is called Rise of the Phoenix. Yeah. So it was a whirlwind for our family, and certainly for Suzanne most of all. But being an identical twin and being so close, it really was something. It took a long time to recover from that.
Absolutely. And I think, what your experience is that sometimes I find that real life is stranger than fiction, right? Oh, yeah. Like some of the things that we live through when we go through these traumatic experiences are so much stranger, so bizarre. It's hard to explain. It's hard for people to believe sometimes, and doesn't even feel real, but here you are in it. And so you had a lot of that happening, and this deep closeness, so that it was really happening to you as it was happening to her in so many ways.
It really felt like that. During the years when something would happen to Suzanne, like to give you the first thing that happened to her, well, she had Bell's palsy, and I think it was the fall of 1999 or 2000. And she recovered from that because the one thing in our family that we do have between Suzanne and I is she's very funny. We have a big sense of humor. I think it got us through all of this to a point. She often joked that she would write an autobiography, and I'll just use the acronym because I'm going to be polite, but WTF. Yes. Because of the things that happened. And one of the things that did happen to her was pyomyositis, which was a rare bacterial infection that she went to the hospital and she couldn't move. Like you couldn't even touch her skin. And then in the course of just like 48 hours, the doctors actually thought it was flesh-eating disease. And it got to the point where they were almost going to amputate her arms and her legs. And then they did an incision and they realized, oh no, it's this other thing. Like things were moving so fast between she's in the hospital, we're calling my parents and we don't know what's going on. The doctors never seen anything so rare. And she was in the hospital. She lost, I'm about 130, 35, but she must have lost 30 pounds. Like she lost all of her muscle mass. She had literally nothing to her and had to learn to walk again. And then within the same year, she got West Nile. She had gone away for the summer. So that happened in the winter of 2001 or 2000. She had to learn to walk again. She was lifting 1 pound weights because she was so frail. And she surprised the nurses with how good she was doing, because they never really thought she was going to regain her strength. And then just a few short months later, after going away for the summer with this new boyfriend, she comes back saying, I'm not feeling so well. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Boom, West Nile. In the hospital for weeks and weeks and weeks. It took multiple tests to determine. And that's where bigger troubles happened. I don't think she ever really recovered from the first illness. And there she is. She's wheelchair bound. She had nerve damage on one side of her body, which was permanent. I think her left side, her leg atrophied over the years. So she had to learn to walk again twice in 1 year. And that's just the Coles notes, because there's one part of the digital memoir where I address the list of things that happened to her. And, the thing when you're a twin, we're very close and we're very used to looking at each other and comparing, well, what's different in you? What's different in me? And it was very playful and very funny. And then it wasn't stopping funny when I realized, like, here she is just in so much pain. And I wanted to take it from her. Her body was changing over the years. And, the guilt that I had for having health and knowing that we were no longer identical.
You weren't a matched set anymore.
No. And, we always were, we really enjoyed fashion. And although for a lot of our years, we both wore our hair short and we really were identical, we also strove to be very individualistic. So often people would look at us and not realize we were twins just for the hairstyle alone.
Yep.
But there was something about, like, Suzanne and I loved to dance, and we could match each other's footwork, like we loved getting attention, and we just breakneck speed on the dance floor and being synchronized. And just little things like that, when that leaves you, when you can't, when the person you love doing the thing most in the world with can't do what she used to do. And it would, these things would happen to Suzanne, and she got a couple of different cancers. She had all these multiple infections. She had more things that, I detail in the book. And I don't really want to make it about that, because I think anybody who has like an autoimmune disease or something, I don't want it to be the focal point, because the thing that was so inspiring about Suzanne was her humor and her grace, and that she would come back and, there she is with a cane. And I'm like, oh, you got another new boyfriend. I'm like, she was incredible. And she was so inspirational that honestly, at the very end, it all just started to roller coaster, and multiple things were going on in her body. It wasn't just cancer. She had mysterious swelling and all these things. Her body, I believe, really just couldn't come back. Yeah. And I remember just falling apart, sitting in a bathtub, drinking probably 3 martinis, just talking to my husband, just trying to, like, why was this happening? Like, what, trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, part of the experience, it sounds like, was that it was one thing after another, and all of them were, life-threatening and traumatic and
surreal,
and things that the doctors were having trouble putting their fingers on and figuring out, and that makes it all the more scary, because it's not just something that can be dealt with, and then it was adding up, and so you're watching this happen to this person that you love and feel most connected to in the whole world, and that connection is changing in some ways, even though it never has changed in some ways. It's still strong, but in the aspects of mirroring each other physically and some of those aspects, energy-wise, perhaps even, you're watching her deteriorate, and that's must have been a feeling that was so helpless for you in many ways.
I think it was like I was grieving the loss of what we had while Suzanne was here. And then we'd have she wasn't always constantly sick. She would get sick. She would give up her apartment in Toronto and go with my parents and recover. Then she'd come back and something else would happen and something else. So whenever the phone rang, often, this is before cell phones and texts, really. And, I always jumped. It actually took quite a few years after her death not to jump when the phone rang.
Yep. Yeah, that's a trauma response, right?
Yeah.
Because you knew that for a long time, every time the phone rang, it was bad news, and it meant that Suzanne was moving just a little bit further away from you and towards death with the experiences that she was having. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some very difficult, heartbreaking, heart-wrenching times for you.
Funny, when I'm talking about it now, I realize my heart rate is and I mean, it took years after her death for me. I understand that rumination is part of your brain processing. You can't process everything at once. So you ruminate and your brain's just trying to just let you digest what's just happened to you. And post-traumatic stress and survivor guilt. And then of course being a twin and wondering, I'd never been alone before. I remember after Suzanne died and we used to, back home at my parents' place, Suzanne and I used to always go for walks, and there was a bridge that we loved to walk to. And my mom, I said, I need to go for a walk, and I wanted to go to the bridge. And I guess my mom she was starting to cry because she's never seen me walk down the driveway without Suzanne. Mm-hmm. She never, and I think at the time, how old I was, 38, or maybe I was 39 a year after Suzanne died, and there I'm going for a walk. And mom's so protective of me like a small child. Mm-hmm. It's like, I am a grown woman. I can walk down a country road by myself. But it was the emotional aspect of it that, not only had I never seen myself as a single person really before, people closest to me had always grouped us together. Yep. We did have individual lives. We weren't, connected at the hip. We had, we were intensely close. Suzanne had her own interests and her own friendships. I had some of my own, but the bond that we had was so close that even though we weren't always together, the nakedness that I felt, and I'll use this phrase for your viewers, singleton, which is something I learned post her death from other twinless twins, because I'd reached out to twinlesstwins.com, which was a great place for me to go. I recommend that to your viewers if any of you all know a twin or have experienced early twin loss, but there is support out there. But just to feel that, like this, where was my identity? It was crushing. Yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, even though you were both adults and had some independence from one another, you were linked. You were linked, in so many ways across relationships and activities. And so this is such a, the loss is immense, right? Yeah. So thank you for sharing that resource. What was it again?
Twinless Twins.
Twinless Twins.
So they have a Facebook group. They actually it's an international organization. And early on, I sort of connected with a few, and I still have them. Like, it's been 15 years this April, and I could clock into the website and get support if I wanted to, or some of the original twins that I connected with. There's a lot of offshoots from that, and other groups that formed, but it was really. Yeah, really, really helpful.
Well, that's the thing, that peer support, people who have been there, had a similar experience, is so very powerful, because they get what you're going through in a way that the average person in the world just doesn't. Right. And so that connection, that ability to have conversations, whatever form those conversations take, with people who have a similar lived experience, can really help guide you and normalize what you're going through for your own experience. Right.
Yeah. It was really, really helpful.
Yeah. But so as you got going through this process, you started doing some work. You're a fine artist, working artist. And so you turned to the canvas.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I detail in the book because I could kind of feel that last year when Suzanne's health was really starting to spiral, that I think intuitively, although I never really addressed it with her, it was just too hard to go there. And of course, I was clinging to hope, because she'd gone through so many things and come through. But I'd been working on this large canvas, and it was, you could probably see behind, if the viewers do go to my memoir, digital memoir, they'll note that the two images from my 6 painting series are actually behind me. because I did create a series of paintings for basically my selfish reasons. I wanted to live.
Yeah.
But about a year before Suzanne died, I was sort of playing around with this large image, and it was like a profile of a woman's face. And it wasn't my self-portrait or anything, and it was just a sad portrait. There was something, I was dealing with, it's like I knew this premonition, like this is going well with Suzanne, like I can't even. And when Suzanne died, I went back to that canvas because initially I was too numb to really, I was just existing. I was just crying all day. I actually worked as in a server in a restaurant. So I was still functioning as a stepmom and a restaurant server, but I wasn't really being that creative. And so, because I was just so traumatized, I was just getting through the day. And when I finally started to go back and look at that image, I'm like, well, it's not hitting me. And I described this because the very first painting in my 6-painting series is called Identity. And that was the first thing I had to deal with, was this crushing loss of who I was. And I literally felt like the world could see that I was half there. I felt naked. For me to walk down the street, that was really, it took years for me to feel okay about walking down the street. Because I felt, and although Suzanne and I weren't touched the hips, I could walk on the street before. All of a sudden, with her absence, I didn't, something had just changed in me. So I actually ripped that canvas off the stretcher because it just, I felt sad, and I knew I had to paint something, but it just wasn't authentic enough. And I'd started doing like scribbles, basically, although I have classical training and I'm very much into realism. The kind of art therapy kind of things I was doing you'll see when someone goes to my project, you'll see a lot of the sketches that formed each painting, but the early sketches weren't pretty. It was a lot, there was a lot of swear words. There was a lot of just, and I had to somehow encapsulate that in an image. So the first image turned out to be a self-portrait. And I won't give too much away, but it's the one painting that actually isn't in my collection now. And a dear friend actually purchased it from me. And I talk about this at this series, like the actual paintings aren't for sale, and they're not. The prints are if someone wants, but I made them for me to survive. But that first painting, it's not something I could hold on to because it was too painful. Where the rest of the 6 images, the rest of the 5, are more about celebrating Suzanne. But that first image really, really kind of addressed the enormity of the loss I was going through. Yeah. And I wasn't sure right away. I created that image. It was very cathartic. And something clicked in me, and I realized I need to make a series. I have a very supportive husband, and my parents and my older sister, they get me. They know, everyone in my family was hurting, but they knew what this loss meant. And even with the love that I had, I was really struggling. And if I didn't turn to, and I also, if you think back, a lot of women or a lot of people do this where they're not really religious, or they have this fleeting idea of God, and they say everything is the universe. And I was, called myself spiritual, but I didn't have a really strong understanding or, a connection with God. So what ended up happening is by creating these 6 paintings, I was trying to create my idea of heaven. I was also angry at God. I had done so much. Even if someone says that they're not that close to God, believe me, when your loved one is dying, you're praying. And so I went through all of that too, where it was really, really important for me to think about heaven and to reestablish a relationship with God. And I don't really get too far into that in the book. But since moving on, it's definitely something I've had to focus on, and it's really been helpful. But at the time, just painting out my emotions, I did a painting of the day Suzanne died. There is an image where the locket, I'm actually wearing the locket that I had designed. And in my memoir, the viewer will see that this locket meant something to me far beyond a piece of jewelry. And that's the first image where you really get a sense that Suzanne is in heaven. And I had to wrap my head around that.
And it's such a powerful experience to take what you're feeling and move it out into the world through art.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the book Bittersweet, how sorrow and longing make us whole, I think, by Susan Cain. There's a chapter about the concept of the fact that artists often take deep pain and transform it into beauty. Mm-hmm. And that is healing and cathartic for the artist, but then it also has the opportunity to be healing for others in the world. And so it's that experience where you say the early sketches were just your raw pain on the page, right? You know, that resonates so much for me as a therapist who uses expressive arts in my work with people. Therapeutic art is often not beautiful in the sense that we think about commercial art, or maybe even commercial is not the right word, but popular art, whatever terms. And therapeutic art can be quite messy and still so very powerful in what it expresses, right? And there's beauty in that.
Yeah, absolutely. The first quote, I believe it's the first quote in my digital memoir, is art is a wound turned into light.
Yeah.
And, as humans, we have to be storytellers.
Yes.
And we've always been storytellers. And certainly not everyone is comfortable with being vulnerable. And then you find out that you've shared your story, that you could literally just empty your heart out. And someone's like, thank you. That's what I needed to hear, because I'm going through it. So there is that strength in vulnerability. There is beauty in it. But it's not what everyone can handle. It's not what everyone can do. I understand that grief, it's not everyone is comfortable with that. And some people are processing their grief in different ways. But for myself, like I remember my mom said, when I was crying, she goes, "You're going to make yourself sick from crying." And I said, "Mom, I'm going to make myself sick if I don't." Mm-hmm. And, I'm so happy that, especially now, we're getting, websites like your own, and there's support systems for people to sort of reach out for, and things when in the past they didn't exist. Yeah.
And that's the thing, the feelings need to flow out of us. And for some people, sometimes that's tears. For some people, sometimes that's building a garden or making sculpture or painting or song or cooking or creating a foundation. Like the feelings flow through us out into the world. And that's how we process this terrible experience we've had. Right. And you're adjusting. And so I can imagine, I saw the image of the self-portrait, and it's beautiful and haunting. And I could imagine that it would be for you a very deep reminder of one of the, most painful times of your entire life. Perhaps the most painful you'll ever have. I don't know,
I think so. I think anything else that comes, I can kind of expect. Mm-hmm. When it's a sibling loss, it's especially painful, I believe, because, we understand that obviously our parents aren't going to outlive us. Yeah. So it's horrible to lose, a parent, but your sibling, you're kind of thinking you're going to go through this life journey with them.
Especially at such a young age. This is an out of order death. It was traumatic in the way that it unfolded. It was traumatic in the fact that it's your twin. Like, there are many aspects. And what we know about that kind of loss with all those compounding factors is that, they talk about a 3 to 5 year recovery arc. And when I say recovery, what I mean is sort of adapting enough to the loss, the physical loss of the person, that you are feeling a little bit more like yourself and functional again. Right?
I'm really glad you're saying that, because this is the one thing that I found, and maybe it's North American cultures, that although there are we do have resources to turn to, but there's still a mindset that, especially I think in North America, we're just go, go, go.
Yeah.
I've learned this even from other people experiencing grief. They'll get somebody saying, "Oh, it's time that they move on," and it could be a year.
Yeah.
That I remember it was 3 months after Suzanne's death, and someone's like, "Oh, she needs to get over it." I heard that a friend said this.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, it's that first year you're basically numb. And the second year is the hardest, I think, because you're anticipating the anniversaries of the death and their birthday, all of those things. And I'm not joking when I said it literally took years for me to feel like I wasn't having a panic attack when I walked down the street.
Yep.
And knowing, having giving yourself the permission to take time, and also in creating this series, I want the viewer to know that it took all the time that I needed. If I'm a working artist and I make a painting for someone, I clock in the hours. I'm sort of charging a rate based on time, or the materials, and all of those things come together. With these paintings that I created, which were large and they're oil, they're generally 3 by 4 feet or 4 by 4. They're not small, but I didn't keep track of the time, and so I would work on one for a couple of years. I pull back, work on it. And then by the time I was finishing it, it was almost like I wasn't even painting it. Like when I was putting the final touches on Suzanne's skin, I have to say that's when I really felt, like, for lack of a better term, I felt God, because it was like I couldn't believe that I actually captured her that well. And I know as an artist, a working artist, that I'm continuing to learn technically, that I may improve as I age. And maybe the best painting I ever do is I'm 90 and then I die the next day. I don't know. Yeah. But the heart, I needed to take that long, because my heart was in each painting. Yeah. And each painting is sort of addressing a different part of the feelings of loss that I was going through. And each painting is telling a story. I've woven all this symbolism into each of the paintings. Like there's one image that's behind me. The viewer could probably see this one where Suzanne and I are quite young, probably 4 years old. And it's this whimsical storytelling setting. Mm-hmm. But every element in that painting is foreshadowing something in the future. It's the cat she's going to have as an adult. It's the balloon that I sent to her on the anniversary of our birthdays. It's the dove looking down. It's the trees that used to be in our front yard. The painting that's directly behind me actually has real leaves that were picked from her favorite park, woven into the oil paint with a special medium. So these paintings needed to take time. They weren't easy to do. They were very emotional. There was times where I would start something and I'd have to pull back, and other times where I was just like full on, like I'm doing sunflowers, and it was like an addiction. I just, it gave me purpose. It gave me something. So it was so healing for me to start to feel her presence in paint. Yeah. When the first one was done, that was my pain. That was purely the feeling of loss. But the other paintings, I started to feel Suzanne's in the room with me. Mm-hmm. And they're not quite life size. They're 3/4 size as far as her figure. But and it's funny, because if you were to walk into my apartment right now, you'd see that there's 5 large paintings. And I mean, I don't know if someone might say it's a crutch that I need them here, but I'm still here.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that anything is a crutch if it's something that serves you well, and doesn't harm anybody. I think that we do what we do to get through. And so here you've created these very beautiful images, and I did look at all of them on the digital memoir, and they're beautiful, and the love that runs in them is so powerful. And I once heard a phrase, and I don't remember who said it, but I heard the phrase, no tears in the author, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. And right, just in terms of what you're expressing, in terms of how much love and connection you poured into each of those paintings, they give you comfort. There's solace in them. There's a connection to her and a healing in them. And so If those are with you for the rest of your life, that's not moving on.
Mhm.
That's moving forward, bringing her with you, bringing that
Yeah.
love with you.
And I want to just mention to the reader, because, I know these things, but you folks don't know, but Suzanne was an artist as well. And in doing these paintings, I have all of her scrapbooks. And I even show, because, I'm showing the background to every painting in my process.
Mhm.
When someone goes to the digital memoir, but, one of her scrapbooks I'd opened and there was one of her paintbrushes. And I remember the day I found that and I thought, I'm not going to move that paintbrush.
Yeah.
Because, I had supplies of hers that she had bought because she was fully intending to keep painting.
Yep.
She was focusing on her, and I do reveal a gallery of some of her works. Unfortunately, her website is no longer, but it was really, I felt, sometimes I felt like, okay, I'm doing this for her and I'm doing it with her.
Mm-hmm.
Using her inspiration. She really loved trees and she loved nature. And so I was trying to capture it. In fact, the last painting, Reunion, which is an image of Suzanne and I finally reunited, I was trying to emulate kind of the brushstrokes that she would do.
Mm-hmm.
She was doing very, Matisse kind of, brushwork that I hadn't done before. And so, and even now, because I have her watercolor paints and I've never done watercolor, but Suzanne used to love doing watercolor. I'm like, where are you? Like, you should be teaching me this right now. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about why I chose the medium I did. So, when basically I was finished the last painting of the series around 2019. And so and then we actually got into COVID territory. And not only did we get into COVID territory, I got cancer. And that kind of just took the wind out of my sails. And I got through it. And I remember just like being on my phone and I'm like, you know what, I've got to write about like what I just did. Like it's taken almost 10 years for me to do these paintings. And the words, my husband would look at me and, I'm just sort of recovering. I'm getting my energy back after all the radiation. And I was just like obsessively typing and coming up with these chapters. And the memoir is only about 16,000 words. It's not that long. So it's not really as if you were to publish a book, it wouldn't have been, a very big book. But then I would read each chapter to my husband and he's like, well, you're nailing it. And I just felt like expressing the whole journey of why I did the work, what was going through me, how important it was, things that inspired me, how cathartic it was, just literally poured out of me. And initially I thought maybe I'm going to do like a coffee table book. And, like how many, like to do it really, really well would have been expensive. And I thought, yeah, maybe my parents will buy one or a few of her friends. But, I selfishly, or I don't want to say ego, but I really want many people to see this work. Not so much because I want to show, hey, I'm this great artist. It's like, I want to share Suzanne. The thing about being an artist and writing about her is now, I don't want it, if somebody knows a little bit about her and about me, she feels less gone. And, I could have had an art show, but COVID happened. And of course, doing that kind of thing didn't really seem feasible. And also with an art show, I'm not selling the work. Of course, ideally, it would be nice to have an art show at some point. But, with COVID, I didn't really think I would get the reception that I would have wanted with crowds and all of that kind of thing. So when I started doing some research and realized that digital storytelling was an option and started finding some stories online that were really, really beautifully done. And I thought, you know what, this is really interesting to me. This way I can take my story and turn it into like a visual diary, a scrapbook that comes to life, that's interactive with the viewer. Yeah. And everyone is on their, their computers now. It's like not just because of COVID, but we all have our podcasts, we all have our channels that we're addicted to. We've got all of these things. Yeah. So it became a really, really good idea for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's beautifully done. I spent some time with it, and it's beautifully done. And it's such a lovely walkthrough of your experience of Suzanne's life, the love between you, and the pain of grief and loss, and the process of healing and adjusting, and the hope of connecting again. I mean, as you said, you feel still connected, but there's also that reunion idea, that feeling that that's in its own space and time in time. And it's beautifully done, and what a project to really capture such a precious story.
Thank you. It took about 1.5 years working with, and I'm generally someone that works on their own. So I had developers and a designer. So I had to learn to play well with others because I'm generally like a perfectionist and I'm in my own bubble. So that was interesting for me for the first time since probably school days, where I had to work with other people because I don't have the computer skills that obviously they're professionals. And I'm really, really happy with how it turned out because I was involved with every element of design, to the fonts, to how I really wanted it to look like this scrapbook that with a viewer can. There's parts where there's hidden things. If someone, is reading one of the chapters, there's elements beside that you can click on and see a hidden image or something that applies to the story. I wanted it to be that when someone were to go through it, that they see something new every time. The voiceovers and the music that I chose, and it just felt like, okay, I can give the viewers an experience. They can sit with it. I wouldn't say that it's not an easy read, but I really hope that the viewer wouldn't find that it's a depressing thing. I hope that they see the transformational pain part of throwing my heart out there and turning pain into something beautiful, and that they get something from that. I'm really, really hoping by sharing it, and digital storytelling is a great way of sharing freely to people, to sit with it and go at it on their own pace, and hopefully be inspired that maybe they can do something creative on their own. And since releasing it, I have had some really great feedback. There was one twin that contacted me, and I was in tears actually, because she wrote a poem to me about her twin. And she goes, "This is the first poem I've written in 10 years." And that I inspired her. And I'm like, and it was really great. And some other comments like this, especially from twins, but not just twins. I've had, I haven't really widely circulated this. It was only released this past summer where I finally got it complete. So, with a podcast like this, I'm hoping people with the openness to this idea, whether it's art therapy, twin loss, this kind of sibling loss, all of this, I think I'm hoping I can reach not just specifically twins, but a variety of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, that's one of the reasons that Grief Stories even exists as an organization with this resource that we've created online, is so that the opportunity to find these sorts of stories and find healing in them through connection, getting the information that you need about a specific kind of loss or a way of coping and healing, and all of that is available more readily. So this digital storytelling format is a beautiful way to extend that reach, and I think you've done it so nicely. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to make a note, if anyone does go to actually watch this, please do it on a laptop or desktop. Because, I've done a lot of reading on my cell phone, but all of the elements don't work. They're not configured for, unfortunately, even an iPad. I wish it were, but it does need to be. So it makes it a little less accessible because not everyone has a home computer, but it's once I think you're doing reading and looking at artwork, you kind of want a bigger screen.
Yeah. And there's often places where you can access a computer, like the library has free access to computers. So if people really don't have access to something, there's an opportunity there sometimes in the community. And that's also a connecting opportunity as well. Right. That chance to be. So, and I think sometimes the big screen is just what we need for art projects. That's just like watching some movies on the big screen in the theater makes much a bigger impact on us, right? So,
Sure.
yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing the story of Suzanne and sharing the story of your digital memoir creation and the paintings. Such beautiful work from the heart, really, in your processes of healing.
Thank you. I really appreciate this platform and opportunity to share with people. It's exciting.
Yeah. It is kind of exciting and so beautiful. So thank you again.
Okay. Thank you, Maureen.
All right. You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Grief Stories podcast. I'm your host, Maureen Pollard. Please remember that grief is universal, but every person's experience of grief is unique. While our interviews are intended to help listeners feel validation and reassurance, we realize that these stories may be different from your own. Please visit our website, griefstories.org, for more stories of hope and healing.